This is an infinity cube, or at least that's what the internet calls it. It's really just a series of straight pieces of wood put together at 90-degree joints. 18 90-degree joints to be precise, and they have to connect together just perfectly right at the end to form this cube. This is my version of it. It's an end table, and it's what we're going to build today. It's a tricky build. It's pretty technical to get those joints to get all together. And to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to do it, I'm going to refer you back to an earlier me who doesn't quite know what he's getting into. All right, so let's talk about the design and how we're going to do things a little differently. We are not making a cube here, nor are we making a coffee table where it would lengthen out a little bit. Instead, we're going to make an end table. That means we need to raise the height without altering the width or the length of it. In addition, to make it a functional end table, I think it would benefit by having as much surface area on the top of the table as we can get. The way the cube is normally designed, it doesn't extend all the way out to the sides. Instead, I want to bring this out, lift it up just a little bit so that it's not touching, it doesn't compromise the infinity part of it, but is more of a functional table. Similarly with the base, what I want to do instead is take these bottom pieces, if they were sitting here on the table, and bring them down to the same depth at the bottom, touching the floor that you would get for this bottom square. The other thing which I have not seen done before, but I want to do here, is that I want to use a laminated surface to add a little more color and interest to the piece. So I'm taking dark walnut and placing light maple in between, laminating them together and making it so that not only do I have a continuous piece of wood going around all 18 joints, but I actually have a continuous stripe running through it as well. That leads me to some interesting choices though when it comes to putting the wood together. So for instance, almost everyone who's put these boxes together and has instructions for doing so if they're working in wood. In metal you just you weld it together. But if you're working in wood, typically what you use is a bridle joint. And a bridle joint works really well when you're using a laminated process like I am here, because you can simply take the other end of the laminated process. Instead of having the two outside parts sticking up, you have the middle part sticking up. You can put them together, interlock them together like this, glue that up, and you have a 90-degree joint. Now that works great if it happens to be that your stripe runs down the inside of the 90-degree angle, like this. No problem. However, because it is changing orientation, you do have a problem when you end up with a joint like this, where the stripe is actually running on the outside, running into the miter. In that case, if you were to use a bridle joint, it would look terrible. So I'm going to have to use throughout, to be consistent, 45-degree miters. Now that does weaken the joint, and we're already dealing with a system where you need strong joints. So in order to accomplish getting some more strength in there, I'll use a loose tenoning system, in this case the domino that comes from Festool. So I'll be putting that in all 18 joints along the way, hoping I get all the cuts just perfect and it will all line up in the end and be strong enough to use as an end table. Like that. See how it goes.
The build process begins by me taking some walnut and maple boards and milling them down to the right size on the jointer and the planer, and then gluing them up into this stripe pattern. The video, however, begins with me taking that glue up apart and getting it ready to work with. I'm afraid I'm still getting used to getting this recording going, and I forgot to record the first few steps. Once it was glued up, we needed to clean up the edges. Here I am taking the glue off and getting them to the correct thickness by putting them through the jointer first and then ripping them down to the correct side on the other side by pushing them through the table saw. Once the striped boards were in their proper dimension, I had to cut them to the appropriate lengths and sizes. To do this, I went to SketchUp and modeled it first. I modeled the prototype that you saw at the beginning of the video, and then I tried 3 different variants. This first one looks like what the infinity cube would be if it stayed the way that it's designed on most builds in the internet. The one that I settled on is this one here, with the base extended and the sides going all the way down to the bottom. Now, I didn't want to run back to the computer every time I needed to make a cut, so I took the dimensions from the SketchUp diagram and I wrote them down on this piece of scrap wood. That's a technique I frequently use when I'm installing baseboards in a house, for instance. I measure it all up first, write it down, and then do all of the cuts. And I thought that would work out pretty well here, but it was a little bit trickier, seeing as some of the miters actually go at a 90-degree angle compared to the one at the other end. I kept cutting, following my plan, and the boards kept popping out, and I thought I'd done a great job until I dry assembled them together just to see how they would fit, and I discovered that two of the pieces were wrong, and actually I had to go back and recut those. The process I decided on for gluing the joints together was to put in two tenons, one at the top and one at the bottom of each joint, and that means mortising out the holes with the domino tool and then popping them in, seeing if they fit through a dry fit process first, and once I confirmed that they did, gluing that all up and clamping it together. The technique I'm going to start with in trying to clamp these together is to create 45-degree cawls on the end. I don't want those to be permanent and I don't want them to mar the surface. So I'm putting a little painter's tape on the ends and some CA glue and putting these little cawls on the end so that when I apply the clamp to them, the pressure will be right up against the joint. This is a technique I've used with several smaller projects in the past and has worked pretty well for me. But you're going to see here that the strength just wasn't in this, and as I began clamping this down, you will see that the cawls slip off. So I, in the end, decided not to use this technique, and I switched to just direct clamping in two directions. So here we go with attempt number 2. I've reapplied the glue, make sure that's wet, put it back together, and I'm going to use two different clamping techniques for this. The first is to take this little black inside corner bracket that's made for 90-degree angles like this, and I'm going to clamp that onto the piece. Then I'm going to take some normal compression clamps and put them on both sides, pulling the joint together from two different angles to get the pressure on that that's needed for the glue to set up. So the inside corner bracket should keep it at a 90 while the other two are putting the pressure on the joint. And I found when I did this that the plates weren't lining up just right, so I grabbed one more clamp to get those to line up on that inside corner. With one joint down and 17 to go, I decided to make a couple of changes. The first change is that I decided not to use those plastic inside brackets anymore. They just weren't strong enough for this application, and I needed a perfect 90-degree angle on all of these joints. The second was that I stopped using the inside clamp to try and make the joints come out in a plane, and instead I started clamping them down directly to my assembly table when it was necessary to do so. These adjustments seemed to do the trick. The joints were coming out fine after the second one, and I decided just to use the same technique on all of the rest of the joints. So at this point, the process is straightforward. I just have to repeat it many times. Cut out the mortises, grab the dominoes, dry fit them together, make sure that everything lines up perfectly, pull that apart, apply the glue, getting liberal amounts inside of the holes for the dominoes and on the dominoes themselves. Put that back together again, grab the inside corner brackets, clamp those brackets on to square it up, grab the two longer clamps, clamp from both sides of the miter so we get even pressure and make sure that they all line up perfectly. And then if necessary, clamp the entire thing down to the table in order to make sure that it stayed in a plane. So I repeated that process for every joint that I could do while still keeping the piece I was working with in a single plane, and that's something that I could clamp down to the assembly table. I then took a 1/8 inch roundover bit and I rounded off all of the edges for all the pieces that I had so far completed.
Well, I've hit a little bit of an inflection point in this particular build. It really has turned out pretty well so far. If you look, we've done a lot of mitered joints, 45 degrees on all of these angles, and we've gotten to the point where we've done all of the joints that we can do while still staying in the same plane. Now we have to get to the point where we have to start going out of that plane. And I've got to ask myself a little bit, what have I learned so far? Well, the first thing I can say is that these joints have come out pretty straight, but there are some cases where it's off just a little. These ones over here, these ones that are in the C shape, perfectly flat right now. But you can see there is just a little bit of lift off from the table at the bottom of these two joints. When I put a measure to it, I find about 1/8 of an inch on this one and about 3/16 of an inch on this one. And I was thinking, well, maybe I should cut those out and redo them, make them perfectly flat. And that might have been the case if they had influenced the top of the table so that it was no longer straight. But actually, these ones are going to stand up like this, and the pressure is going to be on this joint pulling it in a way that would correct it. So I think what I'm going to do is just keep going with the work that I'm doing and just leave them the way that they are, and we'll see how it works out. Now, I've never built one of these before. We will see if it works out. So the next step I have to do is to put those tenons inside of these slots as I was doing before with the domino joiner. But you can see if I take that tool up here, I've got no problem, but there's no way I'm going to be able to fit it into here. It'll hit this bottom piece instead. So I'm going to have to change the way that I'm doing that. I'm going to have to do both holes coming from this top here and simply set the height a bit further down so that I can drill the second hole down here. And the same is true here. I can get the tool to come in right here, but I won't be able to get it in on this surface. I could have marked those and drilled those holes before I glued it all together, and I did realize while I was putting it together that would be a problem, but I also realized it had the solution, so I just kept going. So we'll see how it goes. I think we're about halfway through, and it's looking pretty good so far. I'm hopeful, but time will tell as we put these next few joints together.
And it was just a few seconds later that I realized just how wrong I was. The domino machine would not fit into any of those joints. It would either hit at the top or the bottom, and so I had to go looking for my doweling jig. And I spent an hour doing that, which I spare you from. It was not in my shop in the end, it was out in my garage. But I was able to bring it over and begin drilling new holes, this time round ones that would fit dowels. While a little harder to work with, the dowel should provide plenty of strength. And here I am working on the first joint that I'm having to do that takes me out of a single plane. I've gone back to using my plastic inside bracket, and the reason for that is that my plywood one just simply didn't fit. And I felt like this angle was working out well enough that I could use it again. The trick, of course, to this new joint is it's the first one where I'm outside of the plane and I have to check multiple directions of my 90 degrees being correct, all while playing the game of how many times can I knock the glue bottle over. There we go again. I did find that a good way of doing this was still to clamp it down to my table. I could use my squares to make sure I got the angles right and just applied pressure until everything was sitting in the right position. With each new joint, things got a little more complicated. So not only do I have to deal with all of the tracking of each of the angles, making sure that enough pressure's on for the glued joint and everything, but now I'm also having to deal with gravity. And these pieces, they're solid wood, they're not light. So trying to get them to fit in there in just the right way actually takes a little bit of forethought, and right here I'm not using that forethought very well. So here I got my brain stuck right in the right spot and put them in an orientation where gravity actually helped me and was able to get this joint together. The assembly table provided the key assist here. As these joints got more complicated, not only did I have to keep them all at 90 degrees perfectly, but I had to orient them in just the right way so that I was able to make sure that the parts that were supposed to be planar stayed planar. I took a little time before going any further to sand down all the joints that I could reach because I knew it was going to get a little harder to get inside there. And here we are at the final glue up. This is the top of the table, and I'm putting the mortises in there for the dominoes. So we have to do both of these at once. I should mention here that it is no accident that this was the last piece to go in. You have to be pretty planful about which joints you do in which order, or you'll find yourself in a place where you have a puzzle piece that just simply won't fit together. But here we are with the final piece. I designed the table so that when any of the surfaces came close to each other but not touching, there would be a 1-inch gap between them. So as I'm fitting this together, they're sitting on top of 1, 2, 3 blocks with the 1-inch side out. And now all I have to do is make them tight across on the joints that I'm gluing so that everything lines up perfectly. That stripe is going just down the line and we're getting even pressure on all of the sides.
And here it is, all assembled. And really, I think it came out great. Obviously, it needs a little sanding and some finish before it can be considered done, and we'll get to that. But I just wanted to show you how it came out. There's supposed to be a 1-inch gap in between all of these spaces, and you can see it's almost perfect right there. That 1-inch slides right in. Slightly tight right here. Again, I think less than a 32nd, but totally acceptable. And same thing on the insides here. Slides in or maybe a 32nd too short. In terms of level, I keep my assembly table nice and flat and level. And when I stick this on, that's dead on. I put it over here, tiny bit of raise, but really the bubble's still within the lines. Here again, spot on. There were some lessons though that I learned in doing this. The first is these joints definitely would have helped to have mortised out those holes for the dominoes before putting anything together. Just do them all. The second thing is that the roundovers, especially the inside of the roundovers, I think would have benefited from having them all rounded over before they were assembled as well. So just doing a few things in a different order, and I think we'd come out with an even nicer result. But since we did have a few lessons to learn, I think let's do it again.
Yes, that's right. We're going to make another one. And this time, hopefully using the lessons we learned the first time around. But there is a key difference here. The first is that I'm recording the video this time of the glue up. The second is, as you can notice, that the maple is now on the outside and the walnut makes up the center stripe. And this should be a familiar part. We take each of the glued up pieces, run one side through the jointer till we've got a nice flat surface, and then we take it over to rip on the table saw on the opposite side to get everything back to its right dimension. One difference though is that there's no need for a little scrap piece of wood with some scribblings on it to figure out how to cut out my pieces. I have a template right in front of me, which is the table that I just built, and I'm using that to cut out the pieces into their right shape and end up with ones that work this time, no having to go back. Another lesson learned, no hand routing necessary. With all the pieces available, I can simply take all 4 corners through my routing table and then set them up to see how they line up. I was also able to be a little more organized with the glue up process. So what you're seeing here is I'd taken every piece over to my completed table and figured out how the joints lined up together. I then labeled each one A, B, C, D, and so on, and put them in a line on the table until we got to the very last joint, which was R, and that one lined up with the first piece. Another change to my glue up process was that I decided to do all of the mortising at once on all of the pieces. And where before I had flipped over the piece each time I did one joint end, this time I decided to leave it clamped in place and simply adjust the height of the domino and do 2 holes at once. The glue up process itself, once all of the tenons and dominoes were available, was actually pretty similar to everything post joint 2 from this first table. Glue them all up, put them down, bracket them up from the inside, clamp them to the table. I was more confident this time around, so I was doing multiple joints at once, and so the process went quite a bit quicker. And you can see here we've got all of the pieces that are in a single plane ready to be put together into their final shape. One thing that didn't change is the order in which I glued the planar pieces together into their final shape on the table. But I did keep in mind how gravity works, and so I had my stop blocks around and several different sizes of clamps on hand so that I could handle each situation as it came up. And I was still using the assembly table to make sure that my pieces stayed not only square but in a plane. Now, upcoming here is a good example of learning from your past struggles. This is the same joint that I struggled to get in place and ended up having to switch to a vertical layout from the first table. This time I realized I had everything I need, that the piece could sit right on top of the blocks of the right size, and gravity was my friend rather than hindering me. So now we're on to the very last joint glue up. This is the top piece, but from a little bit of a different angle than before. The process is the same though, and in fact it took a little less struggling to get everything to line up perfectly. Sits on the 1-inch blocks, get the clamps going in 4 different directions to get even pressure on those miter joints, and we have a table. Though maybe there still are some improvements to the process that I could make. The finish I'm using here is a hard wax oil. In this case it's Osmo's Poly X, and all you have to do is wipe it on and grab a clean terry cloth. You can see mine in the back on the assembly table there, and wipe it off. Now, I will be the first to admit that I probably put a little too much video of the finish going on, but I just really love how as you apply these the colors pop out, and it shows you exactly what this end table is going to look like for the rest of its life. And for the final piece, I had ordered some custom glass for the top of each table, throwing a few buttons down here to separate the glass from the wood, and there you have the final table. And with that, the tables are done. I'd love to hear what you think about them. Do you prefer the one on the left that's darker, or maybe the one on the right? Or maybe you just want to tell me how bad my photo backdrops are. Either way, leave a comment, and I hope to see you on a future video.